Hello everyone, my name is Bash Harry, this is the Harry Knit, and we're going to be talking about 10 things I wish I knew before I started knitting, or at least what I wish I knew when I was starting out. Because some of these that I wish I knew, I did not realize until much later in my life. And I've been knitting for like 12 years, so I've been knitting on and off pretty consistently, making maybe 1 or 2 projects a year, maybe 3 if I was getting really into it that particular year. But most of the time, I've really considered myself more of an advanced knitter since 2020-ish. For the first 8 years of my life, I was just knitting hats and scarves and shawls. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, obviously, but I do wish sometimes that I learned these things early on, especially if I knew I could get really into it. So this is what this video is about, the 10 things I wish I knew. If you like this video or you have some tips that you think would be helpful to others, especially if they're starting out, please leave it down below in the comments. I would love that and appreciate that so much. But that's about it. Also, this is a new setup that I'm doing because I just renovated, or at least not renovated, but cleaned up this area of my room. It looks really nice. I'm going to keep it like this, at least for the foreseeable future. But yeah, we're gonna talk about knitting and we're gonna have yarn behind us. I like this a lot. So number one thing I wish I knew before I started knitting. Yarn is expensive and acrylic is okay. It's okay if you want to start out with acrylic. This top is actually made out of acrylic. I was using my mom's Simply Soft Solids by Caron, and I always had the assumption that like acrylic is itchy or it's sweaty and it's not going to be good to wear out. There are a lot of acrylics that are like that, but there's also really good acrylics in the market, and I think that just because people are dissuading you from using acrylic, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. I want you to think of yarn as something that you practice with, and acrylic is a great way to start and practice doing any sort of stitches. You want to slowly build up your stash, and I think acrylic is a great way to start, especially if you don't know if knitting is something that you really want to do. I know many people who have tried knitting or even crochet, and they buy this most expensive wool or cotton they can find, and then it ends up just wasting away in their house because they didn't end up liking the hobby. Acrylic is cheap. Acrylic is also easy to use, and honestly, I think compared to like wool, because of the structure of acrylic, I think it is pretty good for beginners because it's easier to see and define compared to a yarn like, I'm just gonna throw my hat in, compared to a yarn like this, which is completely mohair. It's really fuzzy. If I make a mistake on a project, it's gonna be really hard to take out. Whereas something like acrylic, which I don't have right now, I think that would be much easier for you to see the stitches and see what you need to do for the next stitch, etc., etc. So that is my first tip. Don't be afraid to use acrylic. Obviously, once you get into knitting, like more bigger or more intricate projects or some things that you want to start wearing out a lot more often, definitely invest in new materials. I don't tend to use wool a lot, but that's because I live in a very hot climate. I live in Southeast Asia. So I tend to go for cotton, I go for viscose, I go for bamboo. That being said, I do have a lot of wool with me because I like the feeling. It's soft, it's nice, it's fluffy. The second thing I wish I knew before I started knitting was to read the labels and keep the labels. I started my knitting journey when I was 12. I did not think anything about gauge. I didn't think about anything about needle size. I didn't think about anything about what type of yarn it is. So for example, if I were to make a hat for a baby or even for myself, I wouldn't know how to take care of it because I wouldn't know what the materials were. And it's really important to keep track of what you have and keep the labels. I try really hard to at least keep the labels of at least one of the yarn skeins, and I put them in a book so I know exactly what it is. I also take a little cut of the yarn just so I know what that's connected to, or the yarn that it's connected to. So in case I am deciding to use that project, or I'm deciding to use that yarn for a project, I can easily reference what I have to do with it in terms of blocking, in terms of what needles, in terms of like what gauge is met. And for the longest time when I was starting out with my knitting, I never kept the labels. I didn't know what brand it was. And when I was talking about yarn and fiber and all these materials, I think I was just like talking out of my butt because I really didn't know what I was talking about. Now, 10, 12 years later, I do know a lot more about materials, thankfully. But yeah, I wish I just read the labels, and I wish I kept the labels. That was one thing that I wish I knew, was how important the labels were. Also, some projects or some yarns have projects on the labels, which I found very interesting when I was younger, because I would just go onto the website that was according to the label, and I can see what free projects that the brand had. So I know Drops does it. I think Cascade does it, but I can't be sure. I do remember seeing a website up there a long time ago. But yeah, I think second point is to read the labels, keep the labels, because that is a mistake I have done many a time. The third thing that I wish I knew, and this is something that I'm pretty happy that I didn't do, so this is really for you more than it was for me. I think there are better projects to start off with than just scarves. I think a decade ago when I was starting out knitting, a lot of people on YouTube specifically, because I didn't know any knitters in Brunei, was saying to start off with a garter stitch scarf or do a basic scarf pattern, because yeah, it's basically a really long gauge swatch and then you can just wear it out. The thing is, I don't wear scarves here. It is too freaking hot, and once you figure out how to do a garter stitch, you still need to learn the purl stitch. You still want to probably figure out some other ways. So I think one thing that I picked up really quickly when I was younger was to actually make toys. I made a lot of cats, I made plushies, I made home decor, and I made a lot of hats. I made a lot of hats in my youth. There's some really ugly photos on Ravelry. But anyway, I think toys, home decor, hats are really great beginner projects, and a lot of them are free. So when you're able to work on toys, they will probably teach you like the other techniques, like knit two together, slip slip knit, yarn overs, and even they probably wouldn't do yarn overs, but you know what I mean. They'll teach you and they'll go through the steps. One example that I can give is the Purl Sew Hose little thingy. I can't remember the name right now, but I have it in my house. And I think it's a hedgehog. It's a hedgehog. I knitted that years ago and I still kept it because I love it, and I used up my stash yarn and stuffing for it. It is so cute, and it taught me how to pick up stitches, how to sew, and do all these intricate little details. And I think it used circular needles and DP ends. That is my tummy. I am hungry. I haven't had breakfast. Anyway, there are better projects up on Ravelry, on websites that are free and will probably teach you a lot more than what a basic stockinette or garter stitch or rib stitch scarf can. If you want to, I do have a link to beginner-friendly projects that are free. I'll leave it in here in this video if you want to watch it after this. Another thing that I wish I knew before I started knitting was taking the risk with smaller yarn and needles. I think we do like the gratification of big projects, which I get. I really like making really quick knits, especially if I'm giving out to friends or family, but specifically with smaller yarn and needles, I think compared to bulkier needles, it is much better for your tension and for your risk. I noticed that whenever I'm using bulky yarn, because I'm making a bag out of t-shirt yarn right now, it is heavy and it weighs a lot more on your wrist, and so I had to take a lot more breaks because my hands are getting really sore. Whereas when I'm using smaller yarn, like maybe DK or fingering weight yarn, and using smaller needles, like maybe 4mm or 3.5, it is much better on my hands, and I can probably do it a lot more mindlessly. That being said, I also know that finding all these materials for yarn, it might be easier to find yarn that is maybe iron worsted to bulky weight yarn. And there are some great projects. I just think if you want that look, that specific cool, almost store-bought look, you probably do want to try working with smaller yarn and smaller needles, specifically with clothing. I think when it comes to decor, I usually stick to DK and iron weight yarn depending on the intricacies of the pattern that I'm working with, but still, it's okay to take the risk. I know it's kind of scary, and the project will probably take a lot longer than 10 millimeter project. Like, I feel like I have spent maybe 1 month working on one sweater on 4 millimeters, but that same kind of sweater design probably would take me only about 3 to 4 days on a 10 millimeter. So it all depends on you and what your preference is. I'm just saying, as a beginner, I wish I could have taken that risk and tried out with smaller needles much earlier on. Another thing that I wish I knew at number 5 is how to block properly. I was so scared of blocking when I was younger, and that's probably why I didn't start making clothes until I was like 22, I'm 26 now, because I have always seen on the internet that you cannot block acrylic, and the only thing I had available to me at the time was acrylic. But that's not true. You just need to figure out how to block properly acrylic. So for example, this shirt that I'm wearing, which I think is the James N. Watts color block top, it's made out of acrylic, and the assumption is you can't block acrylic, but you can melt acrylic. So I just like put it over a towel and I just press it until it's a lot softer. You can't do that with wool or cotton, if I'm correct. You can probably do it in cotton, but not wool. So for my cottons and wools, I tend to just block it in the wash. I wet it and then I pin it. I got these blocking mats back in March when I was in Singapore, and honestly, these have been a lifesaver. I also got some blocking mats. I don't have the expensive blocking mats. I have the really cheap blocking mats that I got from the kids section at a shop at my local department store, because I don't really want to buy expensive equipment, especially since I know that these pins are going to affect it and they're not going to look nice anymore. So that's fine. I think it is important to learn about blocking techniques and what works for you and your specific fiber and pattern. That being said, I still make mistakes as it is. I worked on an alpaca sweater vest and it was the right size for me, but then I blocked it wrong and then it just bloomed and expanded, and then I realized I messed up and now I have to redo the whole pattern. But I still kept the yarn because alpaca grows after it's washed, which I did not realize because I have never worked with alpaca before until now. So that is one issue. Whereas something like cotton, I think, especially when you're working with lace, blooms really beautifully. It all depends. Knitting is a learning process. We learn new things every single day. You just gotta be a little bit understanding about how to block. Another thing that I wish I knew when I was a beginner knitter was to read the pattern. If you are a beginner knitter, do not skip any instructions. Do not skip the materials. Do not skip any construction notes that the knitter might give you or the designer might give you. A good designer will provide you the construction notes. They will provide you abbreviation techniques. They'll give you a lot of information to ensure that your project looks exactly what it is intended to. So please don't skip out on the pattern. It's really important. I've made this mistake where I just swipe up and I just went immediately to the instructions and I get confused. One pattern that I did this with was the Jessie May shorts, summer shorts. I made them during 2022. I was like, I made the top. How hard can shorts be? It was really bad. And I ended up making one side longer than the other. So it was an asymmetrical short. And I don't wear them because they're asymmetrical. And those shorts took me such a long time. And also, I didn't choose the right yarn. I think they recommended a DK and I used a fingering. But I thought, hey, I could just turn this into an XS. But I was also using cotton yarn. And so it's, even though I made it an extra small, the gauge was off, the yarn was not good. And now I have a project that I just do not use that is in my closet. I should really frog it. I should. But yeah, don't do what I did. Read the pattern, follow instructions. Unless you're a more advanced knitter and you can probably finesse things, just keep to the pattern. I think that'd be really good as a beginner. Number 7. I have a lot of things to talk about. Number 7, YouTube is amazing. I don't think you need to download Skillshare or any website to learn how to knit. I started knitting without anybody to teach me because my mom didn't know how to knit. My grandparents crocheted. YouTube was the only sort of resource that I had to learn how to knit. And honestly, it is amazing. Very Pink Knits saved my life when I was younger. She's amazing. I learned how to do a knit stitch, a purl stitch, and whenever I'm stuck on a kind of technique, I think I learned the central double decrease. There was a YouTube video there to teach me how to do that, and I could just replicate it. I think it's really important to use YouTube as a resource when you're trying to learn how to knit, because sometimes you don't really want someone else to teach you for like 20, 30 bucks, which is totally fine. I'm not discounting knitting teachers though, or knitting classes, because I too want to organize a knitting class one day. But also, I think YouTube is a great resource, especially if you're a little bit shy. You might not really know how to explain things, or your teacher might not know how to explain things. Or if there's something confusing about a pattern, go on YouTube. The answer is probably there. Number 8, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're going to make so many mistakes. That is okay. I think patience is key. It is important that you learn and just develop your skills as you go along. I think if I decided to stop knitting because I made so many mistakes, then I wouldn't have been the knitter that I am today. Not saying that I'm like the best knitter, but I'm better than I was 10, 12 years ago when I was still figuring out the difference between a knit stitch and a garter stitch and a purl stitch. I think, and it's also okay to give that advice to people. You know, there's little things about knitting that you don't realize gets affected. The way that you hold your needles affects tension. Knowing how to wrap the yarn properly, is it anti-clockwise or clockwise? These things are confusing as a beginner knitter, and once you take the step to really look and just take the time to understand, I think you can get a really beautiful pattern out of it. It took me a very long time to really start doing proper lace work, but I absolutely love lace work. But for a beginner, it can be a little scary. So just take the time. Some mistakes might be made. That's all right. That's okay. It's a song reference. But yeah, you're gonna make mistakes, and that is okay. Another thing that I wanted to say, and I think these are the last 2 that I have, it's kind of connected to number 8. So number 9 is there's always more to learn. I am still learning a lot more as a knitter. I am still figuring out short rows. Like, I've done it, but I don't know the science behind it, and I'm still trying to figure that out. I want to learn more about how to do a saddle like shoulder. I think those are really cool, but I haven't done those yet. I want to get more into techniques, specifically more on color work or balaclavas, or how to implement different types of cast-ons, because honestly I just go for a long tail cast on and that's it. But those are things that there's so many different things you can learn about knitting, and it's just taking the time to learn it as you get older. You might find new techniques that you prefer. You might find new ways you hold your yarn. Like, I just learned how to do a Norwegian purl last year, and I will admit I don't actually like it that much, but it does make my knitting faster if I'm doing rib. But I didn't learn that until recently. So knitting as an art form will always give you new skills as you get older. As a hobby, I think, those knitwear designers are amazing. Those expert knitters, incredible people. I think it's something that you just want to take your time and enjoy the process. If there's something new to learn, take the time to learn it. If not, that is okay. Stick to what you know. And one final thing that I want to talk about, number 10, which I think is the most important, at least for me, which is what I wish I knew, is you don't even have to knit for your family or your friends, especially if they don't understand knitting the way that you understand knitting. I have made so many gifts for people in my life, for ex-boyfriends, that I feel really sad about, not because that relationship ended, but because I took so long to make them a present and they didn't understand how important that present was, and then they just like let it waste away, even though that teddy bear took maybe like a month to finish as a beginner. I'm not bitter, I'm a little bitter. But I just think that you should knit for people that you like, but not necessarily all of them need knits. You can just buy them a really nice present. You don't have to take the time and effort to buy yarn and make something for everyone. And that means the people you do make presents for are special people in your life. I just finished knitting a dress for my fiance's niece, and it's a really pretty dress, but I will admit it took me about 3 months to finish, even though her birthday was like 2 months ago, because knitting for other people does take me much longer than it does knitting for myself. I can admit I am a bit of a selfish knitter, but I think that's okay. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for wanting to only knit for yourself. Unpopular opinion. I think it's okay to be a selfish knitter who only wants to knit stuff for yourself. That's probably why I wouldn't make like too many sweaters for people or sell sweaters specifically. There is a police car outside. But yeah, I don't think you need to knit for everyone. You just knit for yourself first. That being said, on the other side of the occasion, I have knitted stuff for people I've absolutely loved. I still feel so honored and so appreciated that they kept it. I made a chevron blanket. It was my first time doing chevron and a color work blanket specifically. And I remember spending day and night at school because I was like 16, 17. I was 17, 18. And I was knitting this blanket for my friend. And I finished it and I cried, and I'm pretty sure there are like tear stains on the blanket, and she kept it, and she still like talks about it to this day, and I really appreciate that from her. That is it from me. Those are 10 things I wish I knew before I started knitting. Tangent aside, if you do like this video, please do like, comment, and subscribe. And as I said earlier at the very start, if you do have any tips or comments that you want to talk about specifically with knitting that would help other beginners, please leave them in the comments down below. Other than that, I'm gonna eat. My tummy's hungry. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye!